Hello, this is Dave from the Wizard's Keep in Muncie, Indiana, and today I'm continuing counting down my top 80 board games of all time, with this video counting down number 30 to number 21. And my number 30th game is a worker placement game called Ex Libris. In Ex Libris, you're trying to collect different books to build your library so you can become the town grand librarian. Now, there are 6 different categories of books, and the town wants one category is like their preferred category. So at the end of the game, whoever has the most books of that preferred category is going to gain a certain amount of victory points. The town also has deems one of the category of books to be forbidden or banned. And so you lose points for every banned book that you have in your library. Now, when you are getting books for your library, they're on cards, and a card's going to have 2 to 4 different books on that card. So sometimes you might accumulate some banned books to put into your library, and even though they're going to lose you or cost you points, there might be other books on that card that you want in your library, so you find it's a trade-off, so that's a decision you have to make. Also, there's a category of books. Each player has a secret category of books that's their preferred favorite, and they're going to gain victory points for however many of those secret category books that they have in their library at the end of the game as well. And then lastly, you're going to gain victory points for whichever category that's not a forbidden or banned book that you have the least amount in your library. So it forces you to kind of build a balance between all of the books categories that you put in your library. Also, all the books, when they're on cards, when you place them in your library, they have to be placed alphabetically. So you've got a lot of choices or decisions that you have to make to figure out which cards to get, because to be able to figure out can you place them alphabetically in your library or not. And that's one of the things I just like about the game, is just kind of all these different things you got to think about, which categories of books to get, which cards to get. The last thing in the game that's kind of neat, doesn't really have to do with the gameplay, but all of the books are named, and they all have interesting, kind of funny or whimsical titles that just adds a lot to the playability of the entertainment of this game, and that's why I like it. My number 29th game is a game that's really popular and usually really high on a lot of people's lists, and that is what's becoming the new dungeon crawl classic, Gloomhaven. In Gloomhaven, it's a cooperative dungeon crawl game. Just almost think of like an RPG game, like Dungeons and Dragons, but without a dungeon master. The game itself will be the dungeon master for you. And so all the players are going to work together, each playing their own character, going through these different dungeons to achieve different objectives, get new treasure, level up their characters, and you're making different choices based on the storyline of the game. And that's the thing of this game. This is a campaign game. It's like an RPG campaign, which you will probably play over a series of many games that will probably last several months, if not well over a year, to finish this giant monstrosity. And that's what I really like about Gloomhaven, is my love of RPGs makes this game right in my wheelhouse. My number 28th favorite game is kind of the opposite extreme, where Gloomhaven is this giant monstrosity. Splendor is a game that I like to break out when I'm looking for the opposite, when I'm looking for something lighter and much easier to play. It's not a very long game, and though there are choices to be made, the choices are kind of simple based on your turn. You're either going to gather gems or you're going to spend gems to buy different cards. And that's why I like to break this game out when maybe at the end of the night, when I've already played a series of other games, or I'm already tired, but I like to get a game in, but I don't want to play something super involved. Splendor is always kind of my go-to game. Because what you're doing that turn, like I said, you either have the choice gather gems or spend gems to buy cards. And what the significance of those cards is the cards themselves will have gems on them, which will give you discounts for buying future cards as the game goes on. But also some of those cards will have victory points on them. And whoever gets the 15 victory points first is going to win the game. So it's a game that I can set back, kind of veg out and play, and that's why I like Splendor. My number 27th favorite game is a pick up and deliver game by one of my favorite designers, and that is Uwe Rosenberg's Mercator. Now, pick up and deliver is kind of what it sounds like. In a pick up and deliver game, what you're doing is you're going to different locations to either pick up goods or deliver goods. And you're trying to do that in the most efficient way possible. Like ideally, if you could pick up goods in one location, transport them to a second location, and while at that second location, pick up goods that you can transport to a third location. That would be the most ideal. And that's the different decisions that you have to make in a pick up and deliver game. One of the downsides of a lot of pick up and deliver games is that you'll sometimes have dead turns, meaning that if you're making a long delivery, which usually the longer the delivery, the bigger the payoff, but in most pick up and deliver games, you're making that long delivery, you may have several turns where you effectively do nothing. You're like, okay, I moved my piece this many spaces across the board and I'm done. And those kind of feel like dead turns, and that can be a little frustrating in a pick up and deliver game if you're kind of impatient to be able to kind of get to the good parts. Mercator instead uses time as resource. So in order to make different trips across the map, you spend time as a resource. You have so many time unit shits, and you spend those as resources to move to different spots along the board, which means that you still have the same concept of further or closer destinations, but every turn you reach your destination, and so you can make your pickups or make your delivery. Every turn you're doing something, and that's the nice thing I like about Mercator. My number 26th favorite game is a worker placement game called Stone Age. And in Stone Age, what you're doing is, like I said, it's worker placement. So you're taking workers and placing them in different locations for different actions, usually gathering resources or spending those resources to gain victory points. The neat thing is in Stone Age, especially the spots where you're gathering resources from, where in a lot of worker placement games, you place a worker on a spot and do that action. In Stone Age, you can place multiple workers on the resource gathering spots. So if you want more of a certain resource, you can allocate more workers to that spot. Also, the different however many workers you place on a spot is how many dice you're going to roll to try to gather resources. And there are 4 different resources. There's wood, brick, stone, and gold. And in that kind of ascending order is kind of how valuable they are. Wood is the easiest to acquire, gold is the hardest to acquire. And what that means is however many workers you place on a spot, you're going to roll that many dice. And then you take that total of dice and divide it by the number of the resource value to determine how much that resource you get. So, for example, if you place 3 workers on the wood spot, you're going to roll 3 dice and then total up that number and divide it by 3. And whatever that number is how much wood you get. If you would place those 3 workers on the gold spot, you would divide it by 6. So you're going to get less resources based on how many workers, depending on the value of the spot, even if you place so many workers there. Now, part of the interesting thing of the game is there's also this kind of pressure luck as you're thinking about probabilities, because you might risk things by placing less workers at a spot to gather resources, hoping that you roll higher so you have more workers to place in other locations. And so those are some of the considerations you have to make in Stone Age. And that's what I like about it. My number 25th favorite board game is also another worker placement game, also by Uwe Rosenberg, and that is Newsford. Now, in a lot of worker placement games, and including Stone Age, they have this concept of feeding your people, which is usually this sort of balance, because most of those worker placement games have this possibility to gain more workers over the course of the game, which is kind of neat because at the beginning of the game you only have few workers, and then by the end of the game you have a lot of workers, so those end turns are more dynamic because you have a lot more actions. To balance that, they force you to have to feed or spend resources to upkeep those workers, which does 2 things. One, it balances the number of workers you have, so if somebody gets way ahead on workers and though they have more actions, they're probably still winning. They're not running away with it because they have to use resources to upkeep those workers. But also, it adds pressure to each turn, so you have to constantly be building this engine to be able to generate these resources so you can keep up with the amount of food that your workers require. So it's kind of it's a neat mechanic. It's a mechanic that makes sense, but also can be frustrating. The reason it can be frustrating because oftentimes you'll be finding yourself allocating workers to locations just to get resources to feed them or upkeep them, and that feels like wasted actions. Newsford, so one of the things I like about Newsford, it doesn't have any of that. It's a simpler worker placement game. You start off with 3 workers and you only keep 3 workers, so you don't have to worry about that balance of feeding your people. That's not needed in this game because no one's gaining more workers. So it gets down to the kind of root of place a worker, take an action. In this case, you're kind of in some sort of Norse fishing village, and you use those fish and wood to buy different boats and to do things to gain different victory points. So it's pretty simple, straightforward worker placement game, but that's one thing that I like about it. My number 24th favorite game is, it's kind of hard to call this one a game. I always kind of waffle putting this on my list, but I really, really like it. And that is Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective. And why I say it's hard to call it a game is it's really like a super elaborate choose-your-own-adventure book game. Meaning, like, if you're familiar with the old choose-your-own-adventure books where you would read certain sections, and at the end of a paragraph or a page, it would tell you if you want to do action A, turn to page Y, and if you wanted to do action B, turn to page Z, or whatever. Well, this is sort of like that, except with the exception, at the end of the paragraph that you read, it doesn't give you the choices. You have to figure out the choices yourself based on the clues that are given in the paragraph that you just read. And then you look on a map or in a directory to figure out what pages to turn to. Meaning, let's say you read about, or you read a section and it tells you about this murder taking place down at the docks, and at the docks there was some sort of evidence found at that dock. And you take that evidence and figure out there's like initials on it, and it goes, oh, maybe that's the person who made this brooch or whatever the evidence you found was. So you take those initials and look in the look at the map or in the directory and find out, hey, there's a jewelry store that matches those initials. So you go to that location and to kind of see if possibly that jewelry came from that store or not, and then you'll be able to read a new paragraph. So it's a little more elaborate than a choose-your-own-adventure, and the stories, I mean, this game is just great just to read the story, especially if you're a fan of mysteries and Sherlock Holmes. And that's what I really like about it, is it's really just like a giant in-depth story. Now, technically it's sort of a cooperative game, but once again, it's not much of a game. That's kind of like you could play this solo, or you could play it with a group. If you're playing with a group, you basically have one person reads the story out loud, and then amongst the group, you're going to talk amongst yourselves to try to figure out the next place to go, which is part of the fun, is you're kind of each bouncing ideas off of each other. And it almost becomes like an RPG in that regard. And that's what I like about Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective. Kind of in line, basically, the similar type of game, and why they're kind of side by side, my number 23 game is just called Detective. And like Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, this is where the Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective takes place in Victorian England. Detective is a modern day detective game where it's a cooperative game. Once again, you're working with the other players to kind of solve these different cases. But where Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective is not much of a game, it's kind of like this choose your own adventure. This is that as well, but they try to add more game mechanics to it by giving you these resources of time that you could use to go to different locations, and you only have so many days to solve the case. They also add this extra element where you can get on their website. It's almost like an app. It has a special website just for this game, which represents the website for your detective agency. And you can put in different codes from different clues that you find into the website. It sort of like represents your database. Like if you want to look up the criminal record of a crook that you suspect, you can take that code, put it in that website, and it's going to show that fictitious character's criminal biography, and you can use that information to go, further solve the case. Or there might be just some information that you have to might kind of go outside the game, where you have to like Google, and you might have to get on Wikipedia to research a particular historical moment to find out maybe what a symbol that you find, a crest or something, what does that crest represent, and you can use that in the game. So it really kind of feels like you're a detective in sort of like a detective show, and that's why I like about Detective. My number 22nd favorite game is a dice placement game, and that is Role Player. Now in Role Player, you're effectively, each player is building their own kind of like Dungeons and Dragons character. Now at the beginning of the game, you could kind of pick and choose if you want, but you're supposed to kind of randomly determine what class each person's trying to build, what race that person's trying to build, what alignment that character is going to be. And based on what the character is, they're going to have maybe a special ability. What race they are is going to give them a special ability as far as drafting dice. Their alignment is if they're a lawful good character, at the end of the game you want to take different actions that move your character more towards lawful and good alignment. If you're a chaotic evil character, you will be taking the opposite actions. You're trying to take actions that move your alignment to more chaotic and more evil, because at the end of the game, you're going to get victory points based on where your final alignment rests. Also, you're going to be drafting these dice, and the dice that you draft each turn, you're going to take those dice and place them on different spots on your board. You've got 18 different spots on your board, basically for the 6 different Dungeons & Dragons character traits. So strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. Each one having 3 spots where you can place a 6-sided die in. Because those familiar with kind of classic Dungeons & Dragons, to roll your stats, you would roll 3 6-sided dice and then allocate those dice to different spots to make your stats. So you're kind of doing that in this game, except you're basically drafting each die individually and placing them in different locations. And where you want to place them depends on the kind of character class. So if you're playing a fighter character, you would want a higher strength score. So you're going to take your best dice and put them in strength. And so you're going to get more points based on if your strength score is at a certain threshold at the end of the game. If you're a wizard character, you'd be trying to get intelligence score. If you're a rogue, it might be a dexterity score, and so on. But also, every time you place a die in a particular attribute, it's going to give you some sort of an action as well. Like, if you place it in the strength section, it allows you to modify another die. So you could tick up a die or tick down a die that's in another location. Or if you put it in like the charisma location, I believe you get to do like pick up any one of your dice and re-roll them. Also, each turn, depending on the die you draft, because you're going to roll the dice at the beginning of each round and place them on different cards in order from higher to lower dice. And depending on the die you pick, the higher is better usually when you're placing them on your personal board building your character. But if you pick lower die, you're going to it's going to mean you're at a lower initiative in the second phase of each round, which is the buying or merchant phase. And depending on who got the lowest die and in that order, that person's going to get to go to the merchants first. So they might be able to buy better equipment that they can add to their character, or different actions or abilities that they can give their character as well. And that's a different way to get victory points, because you might get a certain type of armor that's going to help your character. If you get the same matching pieces of armor, you're going to get extra victory points. Or you might find different weapons that let you manipulate the dice or something like that. And that's why I think I like about Role Player, is one, the theme of it, because at the end of it, you feel like you've built a Dungeons & Dragons character that you could probably play in a game. But in addition to that, it's a game of making decisions to get victory points. And whereas you're not going to be able to get all of your goals, you're not going to be able to get all the attributes to where you want them to get victory points, or you may not be able to get your alignment exactly where you want it, and etc. But what you have to do each turn is basically decide which actions are going to get you the most victory points, which is going to get you closer to your goal. And that's why I like about it. There's a lot of choices of which things you're going to abandon and which things you're going to work on. And that's what I like about Role Player. My number 21st favorite game is Food Chain Magnate. Now, Food Chain Magnate, each player is operating some sort of a food chain restaurant, like a fast food restaurant. And what you're going to do in that is you've got to develop that restaurant. You're kind of starting from ground level with one small little restaurant in the town, but then you use the resources you get from that restaurant to be able to develop more restaurants or grow each restaurant that you have, hire more workers, which give you more actions. You also have to market to the populace of the town, but you have to be careful, because when you're marketing, all you're doing is increasing the demand for a particular beverage or for a particular food. So let's say you market to the town that pizza's great, and everyone in town wants pizza. We got to be careful, because if someone else builds or starts selling better pizza closer to the town or in a better location or at a cheaper price, they're going to reap all the rewards from your marketing campaign. So those are things you have to be wary of. I really like about it is the different choices that you have to make. I like that kind of starting off small and building your franchise. And also, in addition to starting off small, you only have a few actions each turn. But as you add more employees and build a higher infrastructure, adding more and more employees below you in kind of a pyramid scheme, you're going to get more and more actions. And that's what I like about Food Chain Magnate. Well, thank you again for checking out this video. If you have any questions about any of these games or any other games, feel free to message me on Facebook or comment on YouTube or stop into the Wizard's Keep. Until then, thank you for watching.